throne-y type.
Okay, hello, hello. Could I get everyone's attention, please? Thank you. We're going to get started. My name's Heather Flood. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture. It's my pleasure. Yeah, please clap. Thank you, thank you. Come on. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Paul Preissner, principal of Paul Preissner Architects, a pretty good office located in Oak Park, Illinois. Paul is also an associate professor of architecture at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He received his Bachelor of Science in Architecture from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and his Master of Architecture from Columbia University. His practice includes writing, curating, and designing architecture. He's written a few essays in publications including Volume, Clog, Plot, and New City. He curated the U.S. Pavilion at the 2021 Venice Architecture Biennale with Paul Anderson, and he's renovated a pretty messed up Tudor house from 1934. Most recently, he published a book titled Kinda Boring: Canonical Work and Other Visible Things Meant to be Viewed as Architecture, published by Actar in 2021. Whether he's writing, curating, or designing, there's a what I would characterize as a kind of bent pragmatism embedded in his work that measures the magnitude of deviation required to recast the norm. Paul also works with modest qualifiers. He has a pretty good office, he's written a few essays, and he publishes Kinda Boring Things. What Paul may not tell you is that he's an incredibly talented designer and inspiring educator who's fearlessly traversed the edges of contemporary architecture for the last 20 years, absorbing the shifting contours of discourse in real time, unencumbered by dogma. I know this because I've known Paul for almost 2 decades, and I follow him on Instagram, Distant Buffalo. During that time, I've observed him work through the early formalism of the digital turn, roughly 2004, work through the cool shapes of the post-digital, roughly 2012, to now working on an emerging architecture that's kind of his. His willingness to engage discourse, absorb technique, and produce in a range of media provide the backbone for a position of one's own making. Please welcome Paul Preissner. And before Paul speaks, the final modest qualifier of the evening, this lecture is a continuing education service learning unit for the AIA.
Thanks for the. That's part of the animation.
Oh, okay. It's hard.
It's not, but because I haven't started yet. It'll all be clear. I mean, I hope it's not. It might be. You know, in the book, the middle pages of the book are pink and the ink is green, and that's because I let my daughter pick the paper color and my son pick the ink color. I thought that was a really generous thing to do. And it was great. And then I had it and I was showing it to a friend and they're like, oh, colorblind people can't see this. So I made my first book is like an ableist book, and now I've got a lecture that will, you know, set off people as well. Thank you for the introduction. I know this is on YouTube, so smash the like button. Right? My kids watch so much YouTube. We could do it that way with all the screaming and whatnot. Anyway, thank you for having me here. I'm super thrilled to be here. I don't know why it keeps doing that. It shouldn't. We had it plugged in for an hour and a half before the lecture, and it didn't do this once, so it kind of works out. I'm Paul. I'm from Chicago. I have a practice called Paul Preissner Architects that I run out of my house. I wanted to kind of talk about 2 things here. Mostly the book, kind of boring. I have 272 slides to show, and then we'll be done. So sit back. The first half is the book, kind of boring. The second half is the work from the 2021 Venice Biennale of Architecture, the US Pavilion, which I was commissioner and co-curator of with my partner, Paul Anderson, work partner, who's from Denver, Colorado. So, you know, this is the book. I published the book at a really great time, 2021, so then I never got to speak about it. So this is only the third time in you know, within the last 3 months that I've had the pleasure to even talk to bodies in a room about it. But the libraries, you know, had a kind of ad campaign for it, which was kind of helpful, doing things, and it was kind of good. So the idea basically was it's a book, and it's a book that, you know, I think maybe addresses a kind of crankiness about the contemporary moment, and then also maybe tries to kind of outline what I think a wonderful possibility is for the contemporary moment, and kind of outline it with a certain type of work. Jem in the holograms did it. I don't know if you know what this. It's coming up. Season's coming up again. But anyway, you know, we lost a good one a couple years. So the book is structured so that it kind of works around my work or interest, but it's really a collection of, I think, maybe a third alternate title for it would be things that I'm looking at when I'm working on architecture, and it's really, it has some writings, one by me, but it also has an enormous amount of photographs of either projects that I designed, projects that I built, photographs that I've taken of things that I find kind of interesting or not interesting or kind of stupid or funny, like Snoopy in a cappuccino thing, or the Cookie Monster wave. You know, I think I, like everyone else, looks at an enormous amount of images at this point for recreation or entertainment or escape or out of boredom. And so I think it's hard to not imagine that part of the dumb stuff that I look at isn't shared with the kind of interest in what I'm working on. The kind of outsides of the book are these collections of just running images so you can kind of see work within the context of the world that we live in today. And then there's a set of projects that I did, and they're kind of introduced with these concrete poems by a musician and writer and artist in Chicago named Tim Kinsella. Then there's some drawings of projects, more concrete poems, and a number of essays. The essays aren't about my work, but are about the kind of theme that the work is also about in a way. So, and they were all kind of put together in this book. So for me to kind of collect the thoughts on how to present this, what I thought I'd do is just read a little bit, and this way we'll be able to burn through a number of slides. There should be some jokes, I think, in here. Anyhow, being boring or boringness was, until recently, I suppose, one of the qualities of architecture that an architect would desperately try to avoid. To deliver a boring work of architecture is kind of to admit to a lack of ideas or an absence of creativity. This was a kind of famous, funny thing a long time ago. There's a little subtitle on it, but you know, there's this fresco of Jesus, also season's coming up, but it deteriorated over time as these things do, and you know, the church never fixed it, and there was this wonderful woman in the village that wanted to help fix it, and so they let her, and so she restored it, and it was a huge scandal, and people were mad at her, you know, and all she was doing was caring for something, which I thought was kind of funny and sad in a way. Anyway, the expectations for architecture over the last few decades have risen to seemingly demand that each new work embody a project of enormous formal complexity. This, I always thought, was really funny. It's a beautiful little sculpture, but I think it shows a great selection of people in art class in general, right? Like there's firstly the person who's just offended by what they're being subjected to. But then there's the person who's just trying to draw it properly, right? Like to actually take the art course they're taking seriously and do work. And then there's some scribbles in the back, which I thought was kind of good. So, and structural fantasy, enough to overwhelm the senses and defy one's belief of what is possible to build. This resulting volumetric noise is impossible to escape or avoid having an opinion of. So one either likes it or else you find it repulsive and obscene. And this is kind of a relationship to architecture, which I think is similar to being quizzed. Regardless of your interest in architecture or the work, your kind of answer to it is a requirement. And so by demanding our attention, interesting work simply wants us to have some feelings about it. So the trouble with interesting work is that it's kind of suffocating and also a little bit obnoxious. But it's the suffocation that I think is its core problem. And it's suffocating because the purpose of interesting work is to elicit a very strong and direct response to the work being presented. This relationship is entirely one way. It's architecture to the audience, and the work is there in front of one, or you, or the audience, and you must respond to it. And then you have to put together some feelings about it, and you have to interpret it. It's one's response should hopefully be gleefully amazed. I think that's kind of what everybody's hope as an artist or architect is, but you're supposed to either be amazed at what was made possible, amazed by all the noise, amazed by its presence. But I think a negative response is also entirely acceptable, again, along as it's a very strong one. But again, it's how you feel about it that ends up being what's super important. And that need for the audience to have a relationship to the work through having an opinion about it is what I think is mostly problematic, because that demands that the viewer provides an interpretation to give the architecture its meaning, which is to say that the architecture itself is then entirely meaningless. And the problem here, or the problem that I see here, is that this is to say that it's simply the relationship one has to architecture that matters, and not the architecture itself. So different than indifference or not interesting or especially interesting work is what I guess I'm trying to categorize or think is, this was my daughter's ice cream 2 seconds after she got it. But at an age where she was still too young to know that ice cream is cheap and you can just buy another one. So it was a real disaster. So anyway, is what I think is boring work. So neither something exciting nor comfortable. Boring interrupts conventions that one needs to interpret architecture for it to have its meaning. Boring work isn't a novelty to entertain or even to signal taste, and certainly not to have feelings about. And as a result, it makes space for the viewer in a way that all interesting work erases. This conceptual space, or to say there's a conceptual space that's created. And this conceptual space between the work and the audience is where intention can be understood, or equally possibly, and maybe more often, misunderstood. For unlike work that is interesting or not interesting or indifferent or mute or whatever, boring things aren't without meaning. It's not open-ended, and there's no relationship to the work required for the work itself to mean something. By being boring, the opposite almost happens. One cannot have much of a relationship to it at all. We can get it, or not get it, or not care, but unlike interesting work, boring work isn't a production created to elicit a response. It's non-theatrical. This was by an O'Reilly's auto parts store by my parents, and I always just thought it was funny. There's just this sign on the wall before you go in. I think in the end it's probably for fire departments or something, but it's really there at like eye level for customers, and it's not quite clear what you're supposed to do, other than be cautious. But unlike interesting work, boring work isn't a production created to elicit any response, which is to say it's non-theatrical. And so theatricality is in a way the negation of work's meaning itself. And there's nothing theatrical about something boring, which in the end means that it's not about us, which is, I think, the most important thing, which is perhaps the cause of its desperate avoidance in architecture. No one wants to make work that's not about us. It doesn't require the feelings of the viewer to develop the meaning of the work. Boring things leave us alone. And that ends up, do you remember this guy? And that exposes the disposability of uniqueness. And so we can kind of, I was a little slow on the triggers of these things, but there's this one I always liked. But I think like these kind of nonsensical images in a way are things that don't, I guess they don't kind of easily fit in any particular category. This little news story from a newspaper I always thought was really just wonderful. So it was a police blotter in a Toronto newspaper, or no, in like a Buffalo newspaper, and there were some suspicious people reportedly doing something with flashlights by the side of the street, or in Custer, wherever it was. But they were not suspicious, they were just Canadian, which I thought was funny. But then, you know, as I'm looking and maybe paying attention to all the things that I'm looking and paying attention to while I'm doing work, whether it's because I have kids that got into Garfield, and Garfield became kind of interesting in a way because it's really just the worst comic. I don't know if you know Garfield. It's by this guy named Jim Davis. I think 1973 was the very first Garfield that came out or something. But anyway, it's this depressed cat he doesn't like Mondays, he eats too much, and on and on and on. And he harasses the dog Odie sometimes in the cartoons. He likes Odie, but that's what it is. And it's always there. There was this artist from Wales, maybe, I think, and what he did was he went and took every single Garfield comic and then just removed Garfield from it. So it's the entire same thing, but it's called Garfield minus. Whoop. So it's just the Garfield strips without Garfield, and it turns what's actually a horribly unfunny comic about a depressed cat. How does that even happen? We're going to reboot. Reboot. There we go. It makes the comics insane, I think, right? So by removing the kind of main subject of these things, it turns it into this kind of absurdist work. And then maybe a thing that was a little bit funnier, and I forget who did it, but there was someone who just did a series called Real Cat Garfield. And because real cats don't talk and stuff like that, it's just the real cat looking for each other. So, and then just at the back are some kind of current projects just to see where all those types of interests get you to this kind of miserable aesthetic of just things, normal precast things, normal brick things, in a way. This is an apartment building. Okay, and then everybody loves generative AI stuff right now. And last summer, I was goofing around with it too. But instead of making awful, like, O type architectural nonsense that immediately looks the same as everything else, I wanted to see what would happen to ask it to make a very beautiful man with muscles. So I just typed in very beautiful man with muscles. And it gave me these two guys. And I think there's something even more like profound about the kind of near perfect beauty, right? Like it's not quite right, it's not entirely wrong, and that kind of like sub-normalcy, I think, ends up being maybe more provocative than things that are trying to be these kind of exaggerations of type, in a sense. So that was the first half. What I guess I wanted to do now is walk through the project of American framing. It's a little less funny, but there's some funny things too. So the first, so this is wood framing. We're in a school of architecture. This is wood framing. You're all kind of familiar with it. The idea kind of came to Paul Anderson and myself as a thing to do. We have previously worked together on installations for the Biennale of the Americas in Denver, the Chicago Architecture Biennale, and we were just trying to figure out something to do. At the same point, both of us, we have maintained independent practices. He in Denver, me in the Chicago area. Had single-family houses under construction, and we were just sharing photos, and they were in wood framing, like everything else is. And we thought it was kind of, just nice. At the same time, the cycle for the next Biennale came up, and I had a clever idea. It's like, why don't we make a pitch to curate the next US Pavilion on wood framing, right? Like something really kind of dumb. So wood framing, and then we can kind of explain a little bit more. Looks like this. So it is, I guess, in our kind of like claim, probably America's biggest contribution to the world of architecture, certainly one of its most original. And then on top of that, one that is widely practiced here, widely used here, almost unused anywhere else. Its origins come from early American immigrants who came from Northern Europe or Central Europe and worked mostly in things like this. This is from Germany, half timbering. Around the early part of the 19th century, the American population was expanding. Screens. It's so weird. I think if I go faster, it'll work. Okay. No. You know what, I'll keep talking and they'll come up when they come up. So the population was expanding by birth, by immigration. At the same point, the kind of America at that time had the idea of westward expansion and the kind of moral belief to expand until the ocean, where we're at now. And the passing of the Homestead Act basically gave everybody claim to a land if only they would build something on it, right? And so there was a need for a kind of rapid housing. At the same point, and the dominant, let's say, construction types in the early 19th century was stone, was heavy timber, was brick, was cement, was things that required expertise, kind of familiarity with it, heavy equipment or animals to carry things around, and a certain intricate knowledge of how architecture was done. Things that America didn't have in wide supply with the kind of population moving west. At the same point, when families were moving west, they couldn't really bring a full set of stonemasons with them and all of the stones. The Midwest had plentiful wood. It was a wood that no one really liked. It was softwood. Heavy timbering was made from hardwood. Furniture at the time was made from hardwood. Slow growth trees, really dense kind of cellular structure of the wood, but at the same point, very strong, right? Super hard, and was able to kind of keep the joinery that you would carve into it at the time. We had a lot of softwood, things like Douglas fir and pine, which is a wood nobody wanted. It makes beautifully tall trees, but at the same time, these trees go really quickly. The cellular structure is very loose. The wood that you get from it is damp at first. It splinters. It doesn't really hold a shape very well, and it doesn't have the kind of strength it would have. So through lots of different people over time, the kind of idea developed that you could make, and heavy timber was really done with like 4 columns and like lintels, right? And with these kind of, very delicate joints. At the same point, machinery was kind of developing, or industry was developing. Mass-produced nails were made, where previously you had these kind of hand-forged steel anchor bolts. And soft wood was found to be useful, whereas you couldn't have 4 columns of soft wood, but you could have 80 columns of soft wood in these kind of stud walls that were started to be developed. It had minimal details because you had so many members carrying the load, and you could put them together much more rapidly and a little bit more indiscriminately. You didn't need to worry about the kind of craftsmanship of it to the same degree. And kind of since developing, it's been, let's say, the predominant form of construction in the US. Since then, it accounts for over 96% of domestic architecture and houses. And at the same time that it has such a kind of control over the kind of existential situation we have with architecture, it's a largely kind of unexamined condition of our built world, or our screen world. This is a lumberyard in Chicago, a lumberyard in Seattle, back to the lumberyard in Chicago. Here's just a kind of example of a house in Nebraska that was built by a family, staking claim to their property as part of the Homestead Act. It also is highly flammable. Unlike hardwood, it's not dense, so it catches fire quite quickly. Burns down. Burns entire cities down. But then you can build them right back up. This is in Chicago. They even had a coffee house called the Burnt District Coffee House because it was in the burnt district. Weirdly enough, they built the coffee house out of the same material that burnt down everything around it. So apart from like things catching on fire, there's also labor unrest that happens with any type of industry. This is the Bogalusa lumber mill in Louisiana, which was a lumber mill that had both white and black mill workers. Both were unionized in separate kind of non-communicative unions at the time, or the mill owner happened to also be the mayor, and during a kind of strike decided to then use his mayoral powers to have the police come in and shoot the black union laborers. So this is a photograph from Western Oregon. So Oregon, when the United States abolished slavery, Oregon was eager to do that as well, and then also passed a law that just no black people can live in Oregon. But there was one kind of lumber mill or kind of logging town in Western Oregon that kind of disobeyed that state order. But one of the things that was kind of always interesting to us when we were looking through the history of wood framing and where it started is the kind of novelty that it was used for. So you have things like this colossal elephant of Coney Island, which was later used as a hotel. It was built all out of wood framing. And I think what was interesting to us is that at the time, you know, wood framing, and still maybe a little bit today has the potential, no one knew what it was, right? It was cheap and you could do stuff and you could make houses, but you could also make elephants because you wouldn't use stone to make an elephant, you wouldn't use brick or heavy timber, but wood framing, you know, you could kind of sculpt into anything you wanted. So we kind of looked at the development of it. There's been, I think for something that is now, you know, since the 1830s, there's surprisingly few significant developments in wood framing. There's the kind of obvious one that we all learned, the change from balloon framing to platform framing. And then there's things like the sheathing on the side, shifting from diagonally oriented planks to plywood to then OSB, which I think, I'm trying to remember. So this is Armin Elmendorf, who patented OSB in 1965. I think he was from Burbank, but he's from California. Maybe a local story? I don't know. I kind of forget now. But he made a patent for OSB. Also, the kind of nail gun was a development. Another local story. 3 California people returned from World War II, needed a job, were working construction, wanted to figure out a way to make their job a little bit easier. Remembered, glowingly, I guess, remembered their experiences with machine guns in World War II and kind of modified a machine gun to shoot nails. There had previously been automatic nailers, but they were essentially like a hammer that had a moving cassette of nails, so you kind of had to do that. And then I think the very first pneumatic, like proper pneumatic nailer was made by Howard Hughes, or by the engineer working for Howard Hughes to build the Spruce Goose, I think. But this is the one that everybody was able to actually use. So those are the kind of things. So we were trying to figure out, you know, this is the U.S. Pavilion. It's a building in Venice. It's within the Giardini. The Biennale is an international art fair that's existed since the late 19th century. It happens every other year. In 1980, they added an architectural portion to it. There's two kind of components. There's a general exhibition with individual people selected by the kind of artistic director for the theme of the Biennale. And then there's the national representation, which are hosted in these national pavilions in the Giardini. The first national pavilion was Belgium, I think, in the early part of the 20th century, and other nations did. The U.S. did too. This is the U.S. Pavilion. It was constructed by the Grand Central Art Galleries in New York in 1933 or 1932. And it was done the way that all American architecture in that point was, by kind of being somewhat insecure about what architecture should be, looking to Europe, you know, in a kind of aspirational way. So the U.S. Pavilion was designed in this kind of neo-Palladian palazzo that could be there. And so we thought it would be really quite funny to put something really dumb in front of it and complete this kind of U.S. Pavilion. So not think of it as an installation, but an addition that actually completes the aspirational idea of American architecture for the 1930s with its kind of dumbest form that exists everywhere, the wood-framed house. And to make a proper courtyard instead of this kind of exposed courtyard that it had. So this is just a model that we had submitted for it. And it also kind of occurred to us, just having, you know, studied previous U.S. pavilions, that the U.S. Pavilion typically follows a kind of type, or a kind of, a way of doing it, which is there's a theme. The theme is kind of vaguely worldly in sense. It's certainly contemporary. It rarely seems to be contentious in any way. And then there's a number of architects that are picked to kind of represent their work inside it, and they loosely and less loosely even abide by the theme itself. So it ends up being a group show in a group show, which ends up more being about the people than the work. We thought it would be interesting to exhibit architecture, not architects. And wood-framed housing is also something that doesn't quite have a single origin the way that other forms of architectural technologies do. So we built this thing. It's a 4-story house in front of the US Pavilion. It has all of the kind of features of a domestic house. It has an attic. It has dormer windows. It has a front porch. It has a front entry. It has 2 floors above grade. It has side entries. It has an eave. And it was a way to kind of immediately communicate what the nature of the exhibition is without needing any signs. You know it's about wood. And a kind of like familiarity of an American architecture. It was built in the trees. And you could kind of see the past American, or the kind of existing American pavilion through it and behind it. And then we thought it would be kind of interesting to fill it out with, or kind of explore the theme itself. So, wood, we commissioned furniture projects. So there's 2 artists, Norman Kelly, produced 1 sets of furnitures. Their furnitures were domestic. They were meant to kind of populate the house in front to give it a sense of scale. People like sitting, to give them a place to sit. This is it from the front. So you can kind of see through it, see the pavilion in the back. The ridge beam, the top of the ridge beam is the top of the dome, so they kind of match in proportions. The top of the second floor is the top of the roof of the thing. Here's the kind of side entrance. Here's the other side entrance. But so here's one of the chairs. So Norman Kelly is a practice by Carrie Norman from Boston and Thomas Kelly from Chicago. And what they did was explored another kind of American type, shaker furniture. Shaker furniture is made of hardwood. They made it out of softwood. They made it out of 2x4s to pick a particular dimensional lumber, that is kind of synonymous with American construction, stain it, and then rip it into individual parts to produce a set of shaker chairs and benches. This is a rocking chair. Because it's out of softwood, they chose not to poorly maintain the rocker part, so you get a kind of straight rocker chair that they made. There's a kind of detail of it. Here's just a regular chair, kind of studio chair that they made, and a kind of bench. And they kind of populated the house to give it a sense of purpose, so you could kind of get a sense of scale, and also maybe exhibit another way that kind of softwood is used within the US. Another set of furnitures is by a Polish-American architect from Chicago named Anya Jaworska, and she chose to use this kind of newly claimed courtyard to produce this public seating that riffs off the neoclassical columns of the Palladianism and deals with the kind of shaping of either the flutes or the capitals, and done all out of dimensional lumber as well to get a set. And they kind of align with the columns of the building itself. And then in the gallery, so this show's been exhibited a number of times. So that was the kind of initial prompt was the US Pavilion. It then traveled to a gallery in Prague. The exhibitions are always kind of composed of the same parts: furniture, an installation, 2 sets of photographs, and a set of models, and we'll kind of get to those in the end. So in Prague, it was basically this kind of roof that folded back on itself that was based off of the roof of this like kind of Reformation church. in the kind of downtown area. There's some older Czech people walking in front of it. In Chicago, it was a fully interiorized space, again, with furniture. But the idea in Chicago was the roof was kind of inverted so you could see it from the interior of the atrium as you're looking up. There's a 4-story wood-framed building in the Tadao Ando Gallery on Wrightwood in Lincoln Park, Chicago. And you could kind of see it. And then currently on display at the Palm Springs Art Museum in Palm Springs, where it's again another internalized thing, but now exploring the kind of idea of sheathing and kind of decking as well. So we have that in these kind of clumsy stairs as a way to kind of look at the type. So it's this big like blobby thing sitting in the middle. And then the show's always had these models and these photographs. And the models are the way that we kind of went through the history of it. So I think one of the things we wanted to do curatorially with a show was to exhibit the show and not have it rely on 15,000 words of text and posters and diagrams to kind of explain the architectural concept, but just something that you could kind of immediately get or not get. But you could kind of see a relationship between it. So the models are made of these kind of moments in history of kind of examples of projects. And then there were 2 artists we commissioned to do photographs. One was Chris Strong. He's a kind of commercial and video photographer in Chicago. He does a lot of work, video work for the artist Theaster Gates. He does kind of corporate photography. And then another is a kind of artist in Long Island City named Daniel Shea. And we kind of gave them 2 different briefs. One was to do, Chris was given this kind of brief, and we'll get into his photos, to kind of look at the nature of construction and the labor behind it, and Daniel's was to kind of look at the myths and mythology and the kind of origin stories of the forest. And the models kind of track the history. The models were researched and kind of selected and then put together by students at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And the models and photographs are kind of exhibited together in sequence, so you can kind of go through and see how things work. We'll get through. So these are some of Daniel's work. Daniel also explored the notion of framing, the framing of art for American framing. So you get kind of the backs of the prints being equally important as the front of the prints. You get little dog houses, and we'll get to that in a minute, but where like you get to see the back of the frame, so you end up with the kind of positive of the double hung window and the kind of glass wall of the pavilion itself, and kind of artwork on the back. So Daniel's work was black and white. The range of scales was quite small. These were maybe 9 by 14, quite large. This is probably full scale as it's projected. And they were shot all over the United States in arboreal forests and kind of preserves to kind of explore the fauna, the flora, the kind of origin ideas of where framing comes from, which is the trees or the wood, and the kind of maybe some of the kind of tools or the social aspects of labor that can kind of come about it as well. Chris shot in color. None of these were their briefs. That's just how they ended up working. But Chris kind of documented the kind of chaotic nature of the wood-framed house under construction, the kind of need of all these temporary bracings that are needed to put up until the entirety of the house is complete for it to be stable, the kind of messiness of it where because of things like pneumatic nailing guns, you might end up with only 30% of the nails actually being sunk into something meaningful and the rest just kind of floating through the house in the neighborhood. This is somewhere near here, I think, maybe not so near. But then he also looked at the kind of categories and the people of the categories of labor and the kind of people behind the framing itself. So architecture is often exhibited as this kind of thing, and it's rarely exhibited as a thing that was made by people, not things. And so one of the aspects that we wanted to present are the various groups that are behind the actual work, whether it was Amish kind of family factories making precast wood-framed This is a kind of prefabricated wood-framed house factory, in Indiana that puts things, or the kind of professionalized class of labor or union labor. This is the Amish boss, or the kind of precarious labor that you get at big box stores for ridiculously little money. So Chris spent a couple weeks with them to kind of understand, or just regular house builders. One of the things that was always true of the reason it emerged to begin with is that you can kind of do it yourself without even knowing how you're doing it, mostly get it right, and it doesn't matter, it'll kind of work out anyway, so it's a kind of home build thing. And then we have these models. So the models are the way that the kind of history was presented. The models are at half-inch scale, and they were constructed with the same type of framing techniques that the house they're representing are. This is this is a warehouse by George Washington Snow, who was a lumber businessman from Boston who moved to Chicago. And he's credited with building the first wood-framed structure in the world. We discovered this in the Siegfried Gideon text, Space, Time, and Architecture, where he says the first wood-frame building was this warehouse by Snow in Chicago. And then in the footnotes on the same page, he says that he's not really sure if that's true because there's no source for that. But it ends up being continually cited, his text that he says he doesn't know is true gets cited in the few other texts on wood framing. So it's kind of become this origin myth. So we had a group of students kind of try and track this building down. They were able to find out the kind of business records of his lumber warehouse, which was located right where the Panera Bread on Michigan Avenue is, by Michigan and Madison. So we roughly knew the lot. It was when Michigan Avenue was still part of the Chicago River. We knew the rough size of what a warehouse was at the time, and the very kind of like first techniques of wood framing. They reconstructed this as a kind of warehouse, so it might never have even existed. If it existed, it might never have existed this way, so it's kind of like a ghost in the kind of origin. We exhibited projects like this by a businessman in Indiana named Solon Robinson, who published in agriculture and kind of farming journals this idea he had for something he called a cheap farmhouse. And he basically gave a plan, and he would write how many 2x4s of 10 feet length you needed, how many nails you needed, and you could kind of build it. A kind of early version of the Sears house, which we represent also. There's the kind of communal aspects of it. These are refugee cottages made to house the displaced people from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. They were kind of built on these skids. People lived there. They were able to pay for them and pay down the debt. When they paid it down for their cottages, they could then move them somewhere else. A lot of them still exist in San Francisco, and I think there's a group at Berkeley that's kind of been doing some forensics and like trying to locate all of them. All of them have been renovated in ways, but the kind of basic shed underneath it. This is a kind of utopian idea or project built by amateurs in Colorado. This kind of car drop city type thing, where they built these really bad geodesic domes because they don't know what they're doing, but they kind of had an idea, and so they just used wood and kind of put together the best thing they could have, and you get these kind of wonky geodomes that are clad with parts from cars or windows from barns that have collapsed or things like that. And then you get this doghouse. The doghouse, I think, apart from the Washington Snow warehouse, is the only other thing that's fictional, although the warehouse might not be. The doghouse was there, and the U.S. Pavilion where it's sited is right next to the Pavilion of Israel, which, as you know, often is in the news for things. And during the opening of the Biennale, it was no different, and so there was a lot of police activity around the pavilions, and they had bomb-sniffing dogs come through every morning, but the bomb dog was willing to pose for a photo next to his house. But this is the doghouse from Tom and Jerry. a cartoon. This is Spike. It's his doghouse. It's kind of his, his own version of utopia. We also did research and uncovered the blueprints for the doghouse, so it was built accurately and to scale as well. And it's in here for, I think, a kind of maybe more important reason of the show in general, which is that I think American framing as a kind of construction type dominates the kind of landscape of houses to the degree that nobody really pays it much attention, right? So it's kind of elevated itself to the kind of level of ubiquity that it started to become something that gets subsumed into the rest of culture in a way that other art forms or other forms of architectural practice don't, because they kind of remain a particularness and a uniqueness that prohibits them from being part of general, maybe cultural practice in a way. And so wood framing is something that other artists have taken up as subject matter for their own work, whether in a kind of fine art type practice, whether in a kind of entertainment industry. This is a guy named Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who was a pro wrestler in the 80s and 90s, I think maybe the early parts of the 2000s, and his shtick was to carry around a 2x4 that he would crack. I mean, he was super American, and he would kind of crack people on the back with his 2x4 and yell. It shows up in children's comics as ways to kind of describe the dignity of labor, the kind of necessity of communal work, to kind of see the complexity of the world that children live in, or in kind of comics for adult. This is a Gasoline Alley from the 1920s, where the two characters are kind of walking around discussing the kind of existential questions of life while they're split up into the frames of a comic, in the frames of a house, or whether it's Tom of Finland, who, when he moved to California, became intrigued by the kind of both police culture, but also the kind of woodsman and kind of lumberjack culture within the kind of Southern California area. It's used to kind of communicate settings for plays or musicals. This is Oklahoma. It shows up. This is a really great series called The Rockford Files with James Garner. And I just got into watching all these because they're there. And here's James. So James is being pursued. The pursuant is chasing him in a car, so he ducks into the Kellogg lumberyard, and you get to see all of the kind of activity and busyness of a lumberyard as he kind of parks his truck and runs behind a stack of dimensional lumber. There's the guy pursuing him in the red jacket, and so he activates, right? That would be the kind of the word people like to use, the lumber to trap his assailant, and then he takes the gun from him. So I think like its ubiquity allows it to be something that's actually used in general culture and not something that's limited. So it's kind of like left the world of architecture and it becomes something that's more a thing that everybody gets to work with. This is, Dorothy and Toto. Just within The Wizard of Oz, there's a kind of moment in the book that describes the house itself. And so then we just published all of that and more in this book called American Framing, the Same Something for Everyone. It's not available in the US until July, but if you go to Europe, you can get it now, I've been told. But it should be good. I mean, it is. Cody has a copy, so it's the only North American copy. I'm done, so thank you very much. And I can answer any questions. I have 2 books for the first 2 questions. It's not even enticing a question.
I have a question about the construction of the pavilion. Did you ever take any photos just documenting that process? Like, how was that lumber sourced for Venice? Could you talk about that output? Was it American lumber, or did you source some other lumber, ship it over there, unload?
That's a great question. It's not American lumber. Here's a document of the process in some ways. I mean, I have a lot more, but it's not American lumber for 2 reasons. Well, one real reason. The North American Softwood Lumber Association was willing to give us all the lumber we needed. We would have to ship it there, but American or North American lumber is not certified for use in the EU, so then we would have to pay for all of the testing to have it certified there, which would have been more than the budget for our whole thing. And it also seems dumb to put wood on a boat when there's plenty of wood just north of Venice. So the wood is from Austria. It's Austrian spruce. Having it be Austrian spruce changed one thing, is their dimensions that we could get are different than our dimensions. One, it's metric, but they don't have 2x4s. They have whatever centimeters by whatever centimeters. And so we always had to round up to the next available size. So it's a little chunkier than it would have been if it was here, which you can kind of sometimes see. It's a little chunkier for, I guess, two reasons. Like, that is one. Everything was always rounded up to the next size up. But then also, wood framing as a kind of system only works when everything's all together, right? Like, so that's why when it's being put up, there's all those diagonal posts holding the walls up until all 4 walls are up. And then you need the sheathing to kind of provide the total integrity to it. And at that moment, it's a really kind of rigid system. Until then, it's a real flimsy one. One anecdote that was uncovered when we were kind of doing this project is there was a house in Ohio, I think, or Iowa, one of those. There was a windstorm and the house got lifted up off the foundations and it just rolled down the hill and there landed just on its top. Like, it didn't crack at all. And then that story was kind of told in newspapers promotionally, because there was a lot of suspicion about wood framing in the early parts. I think, some people say balloon framing was a kind of derogatory term that was applied to it because it was light like a balloon and would float away. I think we also found evidence that balloon framing came from the French term la balloon, which referred to something else. Let's get this. This will come back in a second. So anyway, the wood's from Austria. So it's a little chunkier, but it also needed to be a little bit thicker because there's no sheathing, right? And so this had to kind of stay up. The construction process, it's just on a slab, there it is, slab on grade, which we started in February. So by mid-March, it was kind of ready. And in mid-March, the construction company, which was a family, there was 2. There's Minto, which is a small Venetian family construction company that's been there for hundreds of years, and then Grosso, which was a woodworking company that also worked on it. When they first started, they said, we won't be done until July for the show that opened the third week of May. And that kind of gave us a heart attack, and it made no sense to us. And they had a big, they even made this weird rhino model of the framing, which seems so silly for wood framing. You would never do that here. Anyway, we're like, well, get started and let's see. And then I came back, and then a week later I went, and they had done the first floor, and they're like, this is going very slow. Like just the first floor of walls on the sill plate. And then I had left, and then I came back another week, so 11 days after they first bolted something into the slab, and they were done. So once they started, they realized it's pretty quick, and then they were done by the beginning of April. I don't know. Maybe here. So that's the construction story. I don't know. They were panicked, because it's not anything they're familiar with at all. And then once they started, it went faster than they believed possible. We had to produce an enormous amount of structural diagrams to prove that this would stay up. One, because it's in the public space, it's in the gardens itself. So it's not, one, it's a piece of architecture. 2, it's in the Giardini, which is a kind of public space. It's also historically preserved district, so we had to present the whole thing to the kind of planning department and the preservation department because it's listed. So it's all it's not sprinklered, but it's fire alarmed and electrified. And and things like that. So, but we had a document of structural diagrams for wood framing, which like you would never do for a house. I don't know. Does anyone even draw framing plans anymore? You just like put a little note that says 2x4s as needed. Let them figure it out. This is for CE credit, so remember the as needed note is a great note to put on your drawing because it guarantees that you want the right amount, but it makes someone else have to figure out what that right amount is. So flashing is needed, framing is needed. Yes?
Go ahead.
I was curious about what expressions of the frame might be, finished actual things that aren't just the frame, but something where you might see traces of the frame itself on the exterior or the interior of the building. And if we zoom in, like expressions of grain, directionality of grain, pattern, and with this renewed interest in cross-laminated timber, is there an advent for like the frame to make its way into the spotlight as a finished product in a way that CLT can kind of do right now?
Yeah, I don't know. So, I mean, we've gotten asked about CLT a lot because it's also out of wood. And I think to me, they're kind of fundamentally different endeavors in a sense. CLT is really just steel work, but made with wood. So it's thick plywood, right? But it's super engineered. It's done in shops. It's shipped to a site, and then it's assembled exactly how it was supposed to be. Wood framing, I think, was always interesting to us because it's so cheap and ad hoc and almost ruleless in a way. So it's possibly the only form of architectural construction that you can participate in the same way an action artist would. You don't need to have everything figured out, and you can change the things that you have figured out live while you're doing it, which you could never do with CLT. If you wanted to move a wall, you'd have to go and have an entirely new beam and whatever, re-engineered and recut. Here, you just move your wall, even after it's up. Lumber just comes in pallets to the site, and it's cut on site and put up. So I think there's a kind of immediacy to the work and a kind of different approach that CLT is not, right? It's a kind of more business approach in a way. There's no home builders doing CLT things because they can't, because you can't go into Home Depot and buy CLT. So I think they're kind of, the spirit of both are different in a way. And I don't know how much, I guess it's wood. The thing about, one of the things that's always, I think, kind of interesting about wood framing and softwood is that, and it's nothing I care about in the right way, but not in the obsessive way, is that I think it's an inherently, nice way to build. There's very little waste. There's very little waste to the lumber itself. The tree is almost entirely used. The majority of trees cut down are just used for things like paper and toilet paper anyway, but the ones used for wood, you pretty much, they size up the diameter and they figure out what dimensional lumber they can get, and then the waste things go into OSB or paper pulp or stuff like that. So there's very little waste. It comes from trees that grow really quickly. In the early part of the 20th century, softwood forests were declining in the US before forest management principles were started, but now that they have implemented that, there's more trees in North America than there were 200 years ago of the softwood variety. So I don't know, it just seems kind of an easy thing, which CLT doesn't seem easy in any way to me. I don't know. So I think I only answered half your question because I didn't understand the first part, which was...
The first is more like, what's the expression of the frame? Are there ways to express the frame other than just the frame?
Uh-huh.
Do you see this in anywhere besides the pavilion or just before the building's finished?
I don't know. This was just for the thing, right? So it was expressed this way to express the frame. do we have to? I mean, what do you?
No.
Oh, okay.
It just seems like an expressive thing to me.
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I think, you know, there's different reads on it, but there's a kind of like narcissism and superficiality to American culture that wood framing also, I think, greatly communicates in a way, right? Because you can put anything on it, but all of it underneath is the same, right? So Beyonce's house uses the same shitty 2x4 that mine does.
Yeah.
There's no luxury 2x4s. But there's only luxury CLT, I guess. Right? Like, so I don't know. I'm not anti-CLT. It's not this. So back to the front.
Kind of relatedly to this idea, and you talked about the house at one point that this many 2x4s at 10 feet, this many at 12, and this idea of like kind of little waste, and you always see like the blocking is always the weird little pieces that they like cut off from somewhere. And I was wondering if you came across anyone in this research like doing work where they're kind of intentionally trying to work with dimensions that these things kind of come off at, and like are there houses that are like you don't cut any of the 2x4s and all of these things come because they come 12 feet long or they come 14 feet long, and I wonder if there's someone kind of like doing that work that's sort of pushing that idea to the extreme and kind of letting the process of milling wood determine some of that stuff.
There might be. I didn't uncover anyone who's approaching it kind of in that specific way. I mean, I think there's people who use plywood that way, right? Like they refuse to do anything except leave it in its 4x8 dimension. But with dimensional lumber studs and stuff, it sounds great though. Like, but you can get dimensional lumber in so many different sizes. How would you pick which is the authentic size to use, right, in a way?
What I was trying to get at, if there's somebody who's like thinking about what that dimension is
Mm-hmm.
and how it's related to, because it's like, you know, how you move it, how you cut it,
Mm-hmm.
how it fits through the Home Depot door and sits on the shelf. So I just wonder if there was anybody doing that work, if you had come across it.
We have not. Both, in a way, right? Like, it's obviously intentional because I had to pick them, and then I had to choose to put them on pages that got printed and stuff. I mean, a lot of this is just, I have a group of close friends, and we just send stupid photos we see to each other all the time. Some really gross and obscene ones, but then others really dumb and funny ones. Like, my one friend just sent a picture of this new Oreo that's like super mega stuffed or something. I don't know. But so I have because I want to win at this, like I just have a huge library of these that I've saved from searching. And when it came, you know, when I was kind of doing the book and thinking through what work should be, you know, and what I'm interested in, like it seemed important that one stupid hobby I spend an enormous amount of time on probably has some identity towards the project itself, right? So then I just started going through all of those, finding ones that are funnier than others or stupider, you know. Like I think some of the interiors, you know, in summer photos I took, some are bad arts or good arts. It's tough to tell anymore. Some are inappropriate things. I mean, this isn't. This is making fun of the criminal. But some are projects. So it's a variety. And I think the book is structured in a way that the text and the drawings and the kind of concrete poems are monocolor and in the middle, and the photos and the photographs of my projects are bookended and in any kind of random order to show the way there's a way you read architecture, it's through plans and elevations, and there's a way that you understand architecture, and it's through how it fits in the contextualized world. So that's the photos represent that in that sense. Yes?
And in terms of the kind of learning about built work, in terms of client relations,
Yeah.
like the architecture that's not demanding to be interacted with, like that was an interesting idea. What are some of the initial kind of client reactions like? Because some people are going to be expecting this thing to be interacted with, and then you have this very interesting approach to the built work. How are some of those initial presentations?
I mean, I don't have a lot of clients, so maybe that may not have been the best approach, in a sense. I don't know. I don't think they care. You know, I mean, I think one thing, to be honest, like most people don't care about what you do for them, and they want it to work, and they want to be able to afford it, and they want it to work in a way that they understand, you know, and then a lot of other things they have no opinion on. So, I don't know, like the shift from my work, when I first started out of college, I had gone to undergraduate with this guy named Robert Lay. And then I went to college at Columbia and learned computer stuff, and then I started doing that when I was younger and first starting my own practice, and I did the same digital nonsense that lots of people do now. And then around 2010, a few things happened. One, there was really no money to do any architecture because the world's money caught on fire. I had a cancer diagnosis, and it was kind of scary. We found out we were going to have a daughter, which made the cancer thing even scarier. And again, there was no money for people to build projects. And also, I didn't come from wealth or have family that knew that to have those types of clients. But I did have a friend who worked as a carpenter and had a kind of construction thing, and he asked me to do some apartment stuff. And so it made sense to me to try and figure out a way to intellectualize work that isn't expensive, right? That's kind of cheap and most people don't do. And usually what you get is crummy work that they don't care about because they want to focus on some CNC cut foam thing. And so for me, I had access to people doing $65 a square foot apartments. So I wanted to find a way that you could actually make that interesting, or something that actually had content to it and not just the work. And so it meant being interested in sloppiness and making sloppiness a kind of approach as opposed to an accident, and figuring out ways that you can do something sloppy and have it be solid instead of look undesirable. And so that was really the kind of like origin of what this book was trying to document in a way. So, but it didn't get me any more clients. So, like, it's not a good business approach. There was a question. Yeah.
Thank you. So this methodology being uniquely American and you being the co-creator of the US Pavilion, I'm just wondering if you happen to have a pulse on the international opinion of our American way of building.
Well, they loved the Pavilion. Oliver Wainwright called it, for the first time, the American Pavilion is a success. So it was a big hit. You know, I think people find it curious, and there was a lot of questions we had from guests, visitors, and other curators, even about the structure itself, and are we sure this will stay up with crowds? You know, they're suspicious of it. One of the reasons it never caught on elsewhere is I think the US is one of the last, like, cultures to have developed a building tradition. Other places did much earlier, right? And so they had no need to come up and adopt wood framing. They were already fine with bricks or whatever, stones. So they see it as something that is kind of cheap, which it is, but cheap in a negative way, not cheap in a positive way, which is what I think we were interested in. And then they see it as something that tornadoes destroy all the time. Like we were always asked why we don't make them stronger. But you can also build them back quicker. So I don't know. Yes, Bob.
Have you considered that you may have introduced this way of doing it to the Europeans or specifically times, namely because the construction companies had initially told you it would take until July, and then they got it done in 11 days. That would seem to be very convincing, even by their own hands, that this is one system.
Yeah, I mean, they might, but probably not for a lot of things. You know, like in Italy, they still use bricks for interior partitions. Like, it's just bizarre to me. So I don't know. The wood construction company that we use does a lot of things near the Alps, and they're more interested in CLT right now, right, for larger kind of commercial buildings. But they knew wood, so they worked with us on this.
Follow-up question. So what I really like a lot is the photographs you include the work of your work, and especially the structure of the book, the way you kind of carefully thought through where the work kind of exists versus some of these really interesting references, images, and poems. And I'm curious, like even the way you describe maybe not humbleness isn't the right word, and I don't think boring is the right word either. I think you kind of confuse boring and humor, but there's something cool about that at the same time.
I mean, I think I'm trying to identify a different meaning of boring, right? Like, which is to say it's not interesting. It's outside the spectrum of interesting and not interesting, right? And that's what, at least in the remarks, is about identifying or kind of produce, like the architecture should produce this conceptual space that the person's in and can be utterly unconcerned with the architecture itself, right? You don't have to have an opinion of it. And the lack of having an opinion of it doesn't negate the meaning of the work, which I think in spectacular work, it is utterly dependent on it. Like if there's no audience opinion of it, then the work is meaningless because it was meant to be weird or whatever. So it's a conceptual boring. It's not a tired.
I guess my question a little bit is, you never said the word, so maybe it's not the way you think about it, but do you think there's any overlaps with like even the minimalist movement within art, even the representation of minimalist sculpture, the way it's photographed and documented, it's usually humor-free, but it's, in the way you're doing it, I think it's kind of clever, like the way that even photographically, the way things are composed, like the triple light fixture, there was one I think was, yeah, that. No, yeah. I mean, that's, you could maybe find that in the back of a noodle shop, but it's also not that at the same time. And so there's obviously a lot of thought that goes into the production of this photo. I'm just curious if that's something you're thinking about even in the production of the architecture.
I don't think it's minimalist because there's a lot of junk in boring, but it might be minimumist in a sense. I think there's the kind of like, everything that's part of the work has to do a job for the work, and it's not there for entertainment, I guess. Whereas minimalism is a different conceptual project, and then regular work seems to allocate a certain amount of material just for one's enjoyment, right? So I guess boring is minimalistic in that it only works with the composition of the things that need for doing a job anyway. But like, that's not minimalist, right?
No, this isn't. This is straight out of the 80s, but I was specifically talking about the way you work your own work in and amongst these other images.
I had a picture of an interior of the apartment, but I think it's gone, and I think I just have the picture of the exterior, that building. So we did that. mean, that's also not, there's a lot of stuff, and it's kind of deteriorated. I don't know.
Actually, to be clear, I wasn't saying the architecture. I was talking way more about the documentation of it.
Oh.
Like, horizons are kind of removed, people are removed,
Uh-huh.
and not in a Photoshop way, like in a real, like it's beautiful the way. It's like it's kind of reductivist in a way. Like it gets to the heart. Maybe this almost gets back when you were talking about the images you and your friend share that are funny or grotesque or and trying to do one-upsmanship. There's you know the qualities that go into making an image like that that's worthy of sending also kind of shows up in
Mm-hmm.
that you're composing the work. So I'm just trying to put my finger on what that is. You're right, it's not minimalism. That's probably the wrong way of describing it, but it's also not exuberant either. You almost
Right.
talked about what you moved away from in 2003 or whatever, like that kind of digital exuberance, like just because you can doesn't mean you should, and that really comes across in a really nice way.
Thanks.
Well, I keep wondering if it's something that's akin to that kind of cultural zeitgeist of normcore from like 10 years ago, which is now slightly dated. But I don't know, I kind of wanted to pose that to you. You're familiar with the
Yeah.
normcore sense? Like, where do you think the kind of boring sits?
I mean, probably a shared feeling of some things, right? Like normcore is a kind of anti-movement in certain ways, right? It's a kind of a veto against design, which, you know, I kind of have grown to hate design, like both the word, but also the kind of ickiness of projects that privilege design in a way. So.
I wonder if the word you're looking for is liminal. At least like I recognize a lot of these images also from sending them to my friends and be like, haha, look at this. But the like in the image of that wall that was painted almost like a landscape and had a door and a laundry basket or something, it seemed almost outside of regular time, like you could surely be there in the middle of the day looking at this.
Is the projector just off now?
But I
Okay.
agree with you where there's like a certain quality of bizarreness where it could happen to you. It didn't. You're looking at a picture of it. But it just is almost like you're being sucked into that wacky quality of it.
You mentioned it before where it kind of exists outside of the spectrum, like you're choosing images that are so kitsch, they fall off the spectrum altogether. And it's sort of like these are the things that make up the world that we live in that we don't think about because they just blend into the background now, much like wood framing, I assume is the association.
Yeah, I mean, you know, wood framing seemed really funny to do for the Biennale because it's that venue is always used for very extravagant, special, exotic things. And to use that moment to present something that's none of that was funny to us in a way. Like, and then you have to take it seriously. So I don't know. Heather.
Yeah, there's something kind of in the Biennale, the pavilion that's unsettling to me. I'm trying to name it. I'm trying to figure out what it is, and the appreciation for wood framing, the ubiquity of it that came out of necessity and pragmatism, is not. I wonder how pragmatic your presentation of it is. I mean,
Today?
no, in
Oh.
the Biennale, I mean, the pavilion is very elevated, right? The incredible precision of the spacing. There's none of the clumsy crafts that you celebrate in the lead up to it.
I mean, that's the Italians' fault.
It's really,
It's really true. Like,
it's wood framing from an architect.
you know, like the Italian carpenters had these, like, they were wearing really nice sweaters, stuff like, and and we expected and wanted to look up and see like all these nails that missed the joists, but we didn't because they actually like center lined and used.
Did you want to see that?
No, yeah, we did, totally. Like, I really wanted that. They didn't because they would never do that, right? So like every nail was evenly spaced.
Like, to me that was like really accurate, like what you said about the client's
I mean, nails are cheap, and nail guns work quickly, and no one's going to see it anyway, right? Because it all gets covered up.
The spacing.
What?
What determined the spacing?
Of the studs?
Yeah.
It's 16 inches on center, and then it looks less because the pieces are thicker. Yeah. So normal spacing.
But is there not there's sort of lots of contradictions, right? This is really interesting, but like, you know, I'm from the old world, right? And the new world going back to the old world, and the old world being like, no, bro, this isn't, like, we're not doing this, right? We don't even have 2x4 because we deal in proper dimensions, you know, and it having to go through this filter, right, of craft, right, which is the whole Sears robot's not about craft, right? It's about skill, saw, and a nail, right? And it seems like there's I know when it goes back, you're trying to show its kind of roughness and its accessibility, but the context, right? Also, it's in the Gardena, right? And it's actually it's not a criticism, but automatically just through its context becomes much more high art, right?
Unavoidable, right? I mean, like, but
because it's not like, in a way, you want to see the shitty Roseboro green stamp on the end of everything, right? Like
yeah, their lumber had no like mill tags on it either.
Right? So it's a weird, like, I mean, I think that's the correct context for it to go back through that to sort of test it, right? And there was like a kind of like, I know there was a kind of someone at the gate going, no, this needs to be refined, right? Or it needs to be changed, or in its.
Yeah, I mean, it was just how they do it.
Yeah.
Like I don't think they took any more care than normal. They knew it was going to be up for the event, which isn't a mystery as to like the significance of the event. So they just took care in assembling it, a level of care that you would never get for a house at the end of a cul-de-sac in Boulder, Colorado, because no one will see it anyway. So those things are kind of unavoidable, and it seems a bit faux to then prescribe sloppiness, right? Like in a way, I think we want to just work with the level of labor that you get instead of making a kind of mannerist approach to it. So
yeah, I wasn't suggesting you do that.
Yeah.
Saying that cycle going through it is where it is craft, right? It's not about the kind of a module, right, that you buy in Home Depot.
Mhm.
It's gone through a translation, right?
I don't know if this is a question, but I'm
Okay.
going to try to string together a couple thoughts. First, was a fun lecture. It's a fun discussion, so it's not boring at all. But inherent in that contradiction is what you're trying to work through. Is there a connection to that contradiction in the inside joke, in the material okay to be sloppy, but if we can get something out of it, all the better? Is that a return to some of the kind of issues that like Venturi was dealing with when he was trying to make signs, make those jokes, but now you're trying to do it through a materiality instead of your signs?
I mean, I think Denise Scott Brown and Venturi were looking at similar things, which is the kind of quotidian aspects of American culture to find something extractable that's important too, right? And not just dismissible. Working with mistakes is a kind of, if you produce so many architectural drawings to ensure that you have everything located where it is, that raises the cost of it being put together, and then you can't do an apartment renovation in Chicago for $76 a square foot for a whole building. So you have to, or not you, at least the way I approached it is to find things that matter and other things that don't, and that however the things that don't matter to me turn out are great because they'll be in composition with certain things, less of them, that were done in a very ordered manner. So then the mistakes don't look like errors of omission, they look like intentional contrast to a small but nice piece of marble in a sill. So it's a way to figure out how you can do something cheap, done cheaply, in both the cost and effort way, that still makes it a valuable architectural product. So if you're sloppy, it looks like you don't know what you're doing. So you have to come up with some framework so that the sloppiness is the kind of ambition. And also the sloppiness isn't some faux thing that is so overly designed to look sloppy, but it really isn't. You just have to figure out a way to like be okay with whatever happens. And sometimes nothing happens, but that was okay too in some projects. Sometimes you get a weird wooden eyebrow above the closet that you don't even understand why the contractor thought to put that there instead of just drywall over it like on the drawing, and they just said they thought it would look good. And so instead of saying take it down, you just let it go because it produces a weirdness that you couldn't ever prescribe. So that was it. And it makes my life easier, less drawings.
Yeah, I guess that part makes a lot of sense. It's very clear. The part I'm trying to reconcile is the intellectualism to that, right? Where you have to put on and entertain in order to put that out into academia. So there seems to be a contradiction in the, right? So the fact that you have to tell the joke to prove the point, I'm very curious about. It seems like an inherently good approach to deal with multiple audiences, but it again there is going back to the early, to that contradiction issue that's underlying, bringing back this idea now in 2020, right, from 1960, after you've gone through these other phases, right, that we mentioned and Heather talked about in the opening. I guess that's why I'm asking for the intellectual project more than the building project in regards to making it, although I don't want to, I'm not being pejorative about it, I don't want to say it's a stick, but it has to have that, right? You have to have the joke to make it work, intellectually received. You think, is there calculation in that, in the way you're operating at the academic level, the same way you're accepting it in the practical practice level? You know, okay, yeah.
But part of why things are funny, even a small child will laugh if something's absurd. People, what is humor? I mean, it gets kind of deep into like what is.
No, but it's cleverness, right? Like how do you bring in the cleverness, which you need to.
I hope it's not clever.
What?
I hope it's not clever.
Okay, that's okay.
No, I don't know. One, I don't think it's good for multiple audiences. I think there's a very narrow audience that both the book and the work is directed towards, and I don't think there's interpretations of it. I think people can understand it or misunderstand it. I think I don't know. I don't know how to talk about the intellectualism of the project, but the idea of the project is that it's something that kind of understands what architecture is, how you make it, how you do it, and how all of that is done in the context of the world we're in, right? In terms of labor and money and class and taste and things like that. So for me, the intellectual project is a kind of ignorance of the conventional ideas of taste, maybe.
Well, the ignorance is interesting when you say that, because a lot of the...
Like the ignoring of, I guess I mean, not being ignorant of it.
I was thinking really ignorance, but if more what I saw in a lot of the images in the beginning about the boring, where what made something funny in an uncomfortable way is the author's lack of intent to make it funny, but that's how it's perceived.
Right.
And so that invitation, even if it's unintentional from the author to multiple readings or interpretation, seems to be a space you're trying to mine in architecture. That it's not tethered to a singular
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I think there's an effort to untether architecture's purpose from somebody's feelings about it. And that they're not related at all. And that one's feelings about a work don't give it meaning, which is to say that there's no interpretation of a work. There's just what the work is meant by the artist, and people can get it or not get it. Like that, I think. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So much.